Number 10. The Stara Zagora Neolithic House, the home preserved by fire, threatened by air. The first discovery in this investigation did not vanish in a crate, beneath a bombed museum or into the hands of looters. It began to disappear in a quieter way by being uncovered. In 1969, rescue excavations in Stara Zagora, Bulgaria, exposed a Neolithic dwelling nearly 8,000 years old. It was not merely a scatter of post holes or a faint outline in soil. Parts of the house still stood in hardened form, preserving rooms, furnaces, storage areas, and vessels from one of Europe's earliest farming communities. For millennia, the home had survived beneath the earth because of the same event that destroyed the life once arranged inside it, fire. The house dated to the beginning of the 6th millennium BC, when farming settlements were spreading through southeastern Europe. It had been a substantial building, approximately 10 meters long and nearly 6 meters wide, with 2 levels and space understood to have housed several families. Its walls were made from wooden stakes interwoven with rods, then coated in clay and straw. Ordinarily, such architecture should collapse and dissolve into a blurred stain in the soil. But this dwelling burned with enough heat to harden portions of its clay walls, turning vulnerable material into something closer to fired ceramic. The fire preserved an ordinary world with extraordinary clarity. Inside the burned house were furnaces, hand mills for grinding grain, storage installations, and numerous ceramic vessels used for cooking, keeping and serving food. Their arrangement allowed archaeologists to read more than the fact that people once lived there. They could glimpse how domestic space was divided, how supplies were handled, and how household ritual may have entered the structure. A prehistoric home, usually reduced to fragments, had been fixed by catastrophe at the moment its daily life stopped. That is the first cruel reversal of Stara Zagora. The flames that destroyed the dwelling also rescued it from disappearance. Without the burning, rain, groundwater, frost, roots, and time would probably have erased the clay architecture long before modern archaeology arrived. What its inhabitants experienced as loss became the reason later generations could still recognize their vanished home. But excavation created a second reversal. Underground, the hardened ruins had existed in a relatively stable environment. Once exposed, they entered a world of changing humidity, circulating air and fluctuating temperature. Moisture could enter porous clay. Salts could crystallize and force surfaces apart from within. Fungi, bacteria, and insects could attack materials protected for thousands of years. A wall that survived since the Neolithic could begin cracking or powdering, not because of another fire, but because it had finally been found. This is why archaeological discovery is not always rescue. For fragile sites, exposure can be the beginning of a new emergency. Before conservators stabilize a wall or a protective building encloses the remains, the first photographs may record the most complete condition modern eyes will ever see. A vessel leaning beside a hearth, a wall edge still standing, the relationship between an oven and its floor, once deterioration or treatment changes those surfaces. The original exposed moment cannot be repeated. The Neolithic Dwellings Museum was created around the remains to protect what could be preserved. It allows visitors to confront a domestic interior older than pyramids, and far older than Europe's written histories. Yet even protection cannot return the house to the sealed silence that saved it. Conservation becomes a permanent negotiation with damage. Humidity must be watched, temperature controlled, and surfaces stabilized without inventing what is missing. The site remains visible only because people continue defending it against the conditions that visibility created. There are no names preserved in this house. We do not know who tended its furnaces, filled its vessels, or stored grain before the flames rose. We do not know whether its occupants escaped or returned to the ruin. What survives is the architecture of their absence, rooms hardened by heat, objects caught in place, and walls that outlived the people who built them. Stara Zagora begins this countdown because it reveals that ancient discoveries do not need to be stolen or smashed to become endangered. Sometimes the threat is simply modern air entering a structure sealed since prehistory. The house was destroyed once by fire, and that destruction preserved it. 8,000 years later, archaeology opened it again, and every photograph became more than a record of discovery. It became a witness to a home that survived one catastrophe, only to begin another struggle the instant the buried world was allowed to breathe. Number 9. Lascaux. The cave paintings damaged by being seen for more than 17,000 years. The animals on the walls of Lascaux remained beyond human breath. Beneath a limestone hill in southwestern France, enormous bulls, horses and deer endured in chambers sealed away from daylight, weather and crowds. Their makers had entered by flame, worked pigments across curving stone, and disappeared into prehistory. The cave then became its own protected world, cool, dark and stable enough for colors laid down in the Ice Age to survive until the 20th century. What began to threaten them was not neglect, it was discovery. In September 1940, local teenagers found the cave near Montignac. When specialists entered, they encountered one of the greatest surviving works of Paleolithic art. The Hall of the Bulls was overwhelming. Black and ochre animals stretched across the walls at monumental scale, painted with a confidence that shattered any idea of prehistoric humans as primitive. Photographs carried the revelation outward. Lascaux became not merely an archaeological site, but a place people believed they had to see with their own eyes. The cave opened to visitors in 1948. At first, public access appeared to be a triumph. People descended into the same darkness once entered by Ice Age artists and stood beneath the painted animals themselves. Visitor numbers rose until tens of thousands were arriving each year. But every human body changed the chamber in ways too small to notice during a single tour. Every breath released carbon dioxide and moisture. Warm bodies altered temperature. Shoes and clothing carried microscopic life into an ecosystem that had survived precisely because it had remained isolated. Artificial lighting created another invasion. In a cave that had known only darkness, lamps gave algae and other organisms the energy to spread over damp surfaces. Green stains appeared. Condensation formed. Mineral changes threatened pigment layers. The animals had survived glacial change, shifting landscapes and the disappearance of species from the world above, yet modern admiration placed them at risk in less than 2 decades. By 1963, the danger was severe enough that the French government closed the original cave to the public. Closure protected it from mass tourism, but it could not restore the atmosphere that existed before thousands of visitors entered. The cave had crossed a line. Its walls were no longer guarded only by geology and silence. They required monitoring, restricted entry and constant decisions about how to prevent further loss without causing new harm. Later crises proved how fragile that balance remained. Fungal outbreaks and dark stains appeared, despite the closure, forcing conservators into difficult battles against organisms near surfaces. No treatment could touch without risk. A painted cave is not a museum canvas that can simply be removed, cleaned and stored elsewhere. The artwork is the wall, and the wall belongs to a living cave environment. Saving the images means managing an underground climate human contact already changed. This is why early photographs of Lascaux matter so deeply. They do not replace the paintings, and they cannot reproduce the physical sensation of the chamber. But photographs taken before major deterioration preserve evidence of color intensity and surface condition at a moment now unreachable. Every later comparison begins with those images, the bulls before biological growth, the pigments before conservation emergencies, the cave before it became a patient under permanent observation. Replicas eventually allowed visitors to experience Lascaux without returning crowds to the original walls. Replicas offered a compromise. The public could encounter the masterpiece while the real chamber remained mostly closed. Yet a replica also makes the loss visible. People can stand beneath copied bulls and copied stone contours, knowing that the original place is too vulnerable to welcome them back. Lascaux did not vanish in one explosive moment. No soldiers carried it away, and no looters emptied its walls. The discovery remains physically where it has always been, but its original state began slipping away as soon as the hidden cave entered modern life. People came because the paintings were extraordinary. They wanted to witness human creativity reaching across the Ice Age. Their wonder became a source of damage. At Stara Zagora, ancient fire preserved a house, only for exposure to threaten it once excavated. At Lascaux, darkness preserved a painted world until the desire to see it changed the air around it. The bulls still stand on the cave walls, powerful and silent, but the untouched chamber recorded after discovery is gone forever. The camera did not capture the instant Lascaux disappeared. It captured the last version of Lascaux humanity could admire before understanding that admiration itself had become the threat. Number 8. Tabun Woman. The burial scene lost the moment she was lifted on the western slope of Mount Carmel. Tabun Cave opens into one of the most important corridors in the story of human origins. Different human populations moved through this region between Africa, Asia, and Europe across immense stretches of time, leaving stone tools, animal remains, and traces of lives beneath layers of cave sediment. Then, in 1932, during excavations directed by Dorothy Garrod, workers encountered something far more intimate than a tool, an articulated human skeleton resting within the earth. The individual became known as Tabun C1, or the Tabun Woman. She is generally interpreted as a female Neanderthal, or Neanderthal, like human from the Levant, although her precise age has remained debated, with different readings placing her far apart within the Middle Paleolithic. That uncertainty matters because Mount Carmel stands at a meeting ground in human evolution, a landscape where Neanderthals and early modern humans appear within the broader record. The timing of one skeleton can change how scientists understand who was living in the region and what kind of burial behavior belonged to which population. But the most haunting part of Tabun Woman's story is not that her bones disappeared. They did not. Her remains were removed, preserved, and studied. The thing that vanished was the original scene around her body. As the skeleton emerged from the cave floor, photographs captured her position within the sediment, bones lying in relationship to one another, the angle of the body, the contact between skull and earth, the arrangement that might help distinguish a deliberate burial from a body altered by later processes. Once the bones were lifted, that exact physical relationship could never exist again. Garrod's Mount Carmel project became foundational to the understanding of Paleolithic human life in the Levant, and local expertise was essential to its discoveries. A Palestinian excavator known as Yusra is widely credited with recognizing and uncovering the Tabun skeleton. Yet no excavation of that era could anticipate every technique later scientists would wish had been available. The trench could be photographed and described. It could not be preserved intact for questions that had not yet been invented. Today, researchers can seek ancient DNA in sediments even when bones are absent. They can study microscopic layers around a burial, map chemical residues in soil, and ask whether plant material, ochre, proteins, or microbial signatures once surrounded a body. At Tabun, the skeleton remains scientifically precious. But the original sediment touching each bone was disturbed long before anyone understood how much invisible evidence it might carry. The photographs therefore became more than images of a discovery. They became the closest surviving version of the burial scene itself. Researchers can still examine posture, alignment, and visible context, returning to the moment Tabun Woman was found only from the angles the camera recorded. A photograph cannot reveal what lay beneath a bone that was never imaged. It cannot yield molecules from sediment or answer questions no excavator in 1932 knew to ask. It preserves the surface of a moment, while much of what surrounded that moment is gone. There is a deeper human discomfort in this loss. Tabun Woman was not simply a specimen waiting to be classified. She was an individual whose body came to rest in a cave tens of thousands of years ago, whether through deliberate burial, natural deposition, or a history still argued over. When excavation separated her from the earth, it allowed science to study her bones, but it also ended the last undisturbed relationship between her body and the place where it had remained since prehistory. Discovery preserved one kind of evidence by sacrificing another. Her case is different from Lascaux, where visitors gradually changed the environment protecting Ice Age paintings. It is different from Mungo Man, whose originals vanished during wartime transport. Tabun Woman represents a loss built into archaeology itself. To study a buried body, excavators must expose it. To preserve the bones, they usually must remove them. The act that makes the discovery visible also destroys part of the arrangement it is trying to understand. The skeleton survived, and so did the photographs made before removal, but the cave floor as it held her can never be reopened. Modern technology may return to Tabun and ask new questions of remaining sediments, yet it cannot place the woman back into the exact ground that once enclosed her. Her discovery endures in museum study and archival images, while the most fragile evidence, the untouched meeting point between body and earth, lasted only until the moment human hands lifted it away. Number 7. Solo Man. The fossils that survived while their certainty faded on a terrace above the Solo River in Java. A group of ancient human skulls emerged from the earth during the early 1930s. Excavations at Nangong recovered 12 cranial vaults and 2 lower leg bones, a concentration of human remains unlike almost anything else known from Southeast Asia. The fossils would later be recognized as late survivors of Homo erectus, members of a human lineage that endured on Java long after much of the world had changed. Unlike the missing fossils of Peking Man, the Nangong skulls did not vanish. What disappeared was the certainty surrounding the ground that had held them. The skulls remain striking. Their vaults are long and low, with thick bone and powerful brow structures characteristic of Homo erectus. Yet their brain sizes approach the lower range of modern humans. These were not remote ancestors easily dismissed as primitive. They belonged to a late population of an archaic human form, one that may have remained on Java until roughly 117,000 to 108,000 years ago. If those dates hold, Solo Man represents one of the last known chapters of Homo erectus anywhere on Earth. That late survival makes the site extraordinary. By the time the people of Nangong lived, other human lineages existed elsewhere and Southeast Asian environments were shifting. Open landscapes may have contracted as wetter forest expanded across parts of Java. A population adapted to older habitats could have become isolated before disappearing. The skulls may stand near the end of a lineage that persisted for more than 1 million years, which means every detail of how they entered the earth matters. But Nangong was not a simple graveyard. The remains came from deposits linked to an ancient river terrace, alongside large quantities of animal bone. Rivers can move bodies, separate skulls from skeletons, and gather remains far from where individuals died. A hollow cranial vault behaves differently in floodwater than a dense limb bone. It can roll, settle against debris, and accumulate with other rounded remains. The cluster of skulls at Nandong may therefore record a natural river process, rather than a single death event or deliberate human action. To decide between those possibilities, scientists need more than fossils. They need precise excavation positions, sediment relationships, depth orientation association with animal remains, and the layers surrounding each object. Much of that information was recorded under the limits of early 20th century fieldwork, then carried through political rupture, the Japanese occupation of Java, the Second World War, and the instability that followed disrupted study and custody. One Gandong skull was taken to Tokyo during the war before being returned afterward. The fossil came back. The uninterrupted chain of context did not. This created a quieter form of archaeological loss. A skull can remain safe in a collection, available for measurement and scanning, while part of its story has faded beyond retrieval. Modern researchers can redate sediments, return to the terrace, and construct stronger geological models. What they cannot do is reopen the original 1930s excavation exactly as it was, and record every skull with the precision now expected. Every incomplete note and broken association leaves uncertainty around one of the last surviving populations of Homo erectus. The uncertainty does not weaken Solo Man. It makes the fossils more haunting. Peking Man was reduced to casts and photographs because the bones themselves disappeared. Solo Man presents the opposite problem. The original skulls survive, but the landscape of their final deposition is partly unreachable. We can study the cranial vaults and place them within human evolution. What we cannot completely recover is how 12 ancient human skulls came to rest together above the Solo River. Perhaps floodwater gathered them after death. Perhaps the assemblage formed through several events over time. Perhaps some detail lost during excavation would have made the answer clearer. The skulls survived war, transport, and decades of argument. But survival alone could not preserve everything. At Nangong disappearance did not require theft or destruction. It occurred in the gap between what early excavators recorded and what later science needed to know. The heavy brows and long vaults remain, preserving one of the final forms of Homo erectus. Yet around them lies an invisible absence, a river terrace disturbed, imperfectly documented, and never recoverable in its original state. Solo Man reminds us that an ancient discovery can remain physically present, while the certainty that gives it meaning slowly slips beyond reach. Number 6. Mungo Man. The ancestor returned beyond unrestricted study in the dry basin of Lake Mungo. The land preserves an ancient shoreline, where water vanished but human memory never truly did. When geologist Jim Bowler encountered human remains eroding from the dunes in 1974, the discovery was extraordinary. The individual became known as Mungo Man, or LM3. He had been laid to rest over 40,000 years ago, his burial associated with red ochre, a deliberate treatment revealing ceremonial thought at a depth of time few people had imagined for Australia. The Willandra Lakes had once been a living environment of water, fish, camps and movement across country. Mungo Man belonged to that world, and his burial showed that people were not simply surviving there in the Pleistocene. They were caring for their dead through ritual, carrying pigment and meaning into a grave older than many of humanity's most celebrated monuments. His discovery placed Aboriginal history deep within one of humanity's oldest surviving chapters. But from the moment his remains were removed, the discovery could not belong only to science. Mungo Man was not a fossil animal or an anonymous object. He was an ancestor connected to the traditional owners of the Willandra Lakes region. For decades, however, his remains were held far from the landscape in which he had been buried, kept in institutional custody and studied during a period when indigenous communities were too often excluded from decisions about ancestral bodies taken from their lands. Photographs, measurements, casts and studies accumulated. But so did the question beneath them: who had the right to decide what happened next? To a laboratory, the remains represented rare opportunities for future analysis. New techniques might one day seek chemical traces in bone, or answer questions no researcher in 1974 could anticipate. To many Aboriginal custodians, those possibilities did not erase the fact that a person had been removed from his resting place and held away from country for decades. In 2017, Mungo Man was returned to the Willandra Lakes region. The return was not a disappearance in the sense of crates lost during war or museum objects shattered beneath bombs. It was repatriation, responsibility moving away from institutions that had long claimed access and back toward communities whose ancestral landscape had protected him for tens of thousands of years. In 2022, Mungo Man and Mungo Lady were reburied on country, an outcome supported by some custodians and opposed by others who had preferred a keeping place under indigenous authority, where respectful, controlled access might remain possible. That disagreement is part of the story, because repatriation is not a simple ending. It can bring dignity in return while also raising questions about how communities preserve knowledge, how different voices are heard, and whether research should continue under cultural authority. What changed permanently was the assumption that science alone could decide. Mungo Man's remains were no longer available for unrestricted study because researchers valued the answers they might contain. This change in access is not the same as the destruction of evidence. Earlier records remain. Photographs, casts, dating work, descriptions, and published interpretations. They preserve much of what researchers had already observed. But they cannot substitute for direct analysis of the original body. A photograph cannot provide a new sample. A cast cannot preserve undiscovered molecules. Measurements taken decades ago cannot answer every question future techniques may ask. In returning an ancestor to the earth, society accepted that some knowledge would no longer be pursued on the same terms. That is why Mungo Man belongs in this investigation only with care. He was not destroyed by ignorance, nor erased by crime. His story exposes the boundary between discovery and possession. Archaeology can uncover the dead, classify them, and publish what their bodies reveal. But an ancient person may still belong to living relationships that cannot be reduced to data. Preservation can become another form of removal when the communities most closely connected to an ancestor are denied authority over his rest. At Tabun Cave, a burial scene vanished when a skeleton was lifted from sediment. At Ngong, context faded through disrupted records and war. At Lake Mungo, access changed because the remains carried a cultural claim stronger than a museum drawer. The images and reports preserve a scientific window onto a man buried more than 40,000 years ago. The body itself has returned to country, beyond the assumption of unlimited examination. Mungo Man leaves this countdown with a question far darker than simple disappearance. When we uncover an ancient person, is the greatest tragedy that science might lose access to the body, or that discovery once allowed us to forget the person was never ours to keep. Number 5. The Berlin Ice Age Collection. Mammoths buried a second time in war before the Second World War reduced cities to rubble. Berlin's Museum Fr. Naturkunde held one of Europe's great collections of vanished life. Its halls and storage rooms contained remains of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears and cave lions from the Pleistocene world. These creatures had already survived one impossible journey. Their bones had crossed tens of thousands of years through frozen ground and excavation, emerging from a lost ice age to be catalogued and protected beneath museum roofs. Then modern history reached them with a force no glacier had prepared them to survive. By the final years of the war, museum workers understood the danger. Air raids had turned collections across Europe into casualties of urban destruction. Beginning in 1943, efforts were made to move important specimens away from exposed buildings. But a natural history museum is not a cabinet of portable treasure. Large fossil mounts are heavy, fragile, and often fixed to steel frames and display structures. Dismantling them takes care, labor, and time. In wartime, those were precisely the things running out. On February 3, 1945, bombing struck Berlin and severely damaged the museum's east wing. Explosions broke walls and ceilings. Falling masonry smashed cabinets and mounts. Fire threatened material already fractured by impact. Water used against flames soaked labels and specimens. Dust buried what had survived beneath broken glass and debris. When the structure collapsed, Ice Age animals that had once lain beneath prehistoric earth were entombed, again beneath brick and ash. The loss was not only visual. A fossil in a museum is more than a dramatic object. A mammoth molar, a cave lion jaw, or a woolly rhinoceros bone carries value, because it is connected to a locality, a catalogue number, and a geological layer. If a specimen is crushed beyond recognition, or survives while its label disappears, much of that meaning collapses with it. An unnumbered tooth recovered from rubble may still be ancient, but without provenance, it becomes separated from the questions it once answered. That loss has become greater with time. Modern paleontology can search Ice Age bones for collagen, ancient proteins and isotope signatures. Those methods can reveal diet, migration, climate, and evolutionary relationships in ways early curators could not have imagined. But no new method can sample a fossil that was destroyed or separated from its identity. The bombing erased not only objects understood in 1945, but discoveries future science might have extracted from them. Some objects were recovered. Some material had been evacuated before destruction. Others remained damaged, buried, or impossible to identify amid post-war confusion and broken records. What could be reconstructed depended on inventory cards, measurements, catalogues, and photographs made when the collection still appeared secure. In those old images, a mounted skeleton or cabinet fossil might stand complete, unaware that the photograph would soon become one of the only witnesses to what had existed there. There is something uniquely haunting about prehistoric remains destroyed in a modern war. Mammoths and cave bears belonged to worlds of frozen grasslands and vanished ecosystems. Their fossils were not military targets. They were evidence of life long before Berlin existed. Yet once collected inside a human institution, they became vulnerable to human catastrophe. The museum preserved extinct animals, but it also placed them inside the risks of our own history. The ruined wing became a second fossil site, a layer of 20th century destruction lying over remains from the Pleistocene. Specimens recovered from rubble could carry new scars, scorched surfaces, broken edges, dust and heat damage added to bones already shaped by ancient death. A fossil that once testified only to the Ice Age could now also testify to the night a museum failed to protect it from the modern world. This is a different disappearance from the cases before it. Lascaux remains inside its cave, altered but guarded. Mungo Man was returned through cultural authority rather than destroyed. Berlin suffered physical loss so complete that documentation had to stand in for what could no longer be studied directly. A photograph could prove that a mammoth fossil had once existed in a gallery. It could not return the bone, its chemistry, or the future knowledge locked inside it. Thousands of years after the Ice Age ended, the giants of that world were gathered beneath one roof so humanity could remember them. Then, in hours of bombing and collapse, some were lost again. Their first burial belonged to nature, their second belonged to us. In the ruins of a museum wing, extinct animals became evidence of a colder truth. Discovery does not guarantee survival, and even prehistory can be destroyed by the disasters of the present. Number 4. Tell Halaf, the sculptures rebuilt from 27,000 fragments long before bombs fell on Berlin. The sculptures of Tell Halaf had already survived the disappearance of the world that made them. They came from northeastern Syria, from an ancient palace once guarded by carved animals, divine figures, and monumental stone forms. Their creators belonged to an Aramean kingdom of the early 1st millennium BC, a power that faded while parts of its art endured beneath the earth. When archaeologists uncovered those sculptures in the 20th century, it appeared they had been rescued from oblivion. Instead, they had only been moved toward a second destruction. The site was excavated by Max von Oppenheim, whose work uncovered a palace associated with the ruler Kapara. Many dramatic pieces were carved from dark basalt, figures designed to stand at thresholds and proclaim authority. Oppenheim brought major works to Berlin, where he created a museum devoted to Tell Halaf. Visitors walked among stones carved in Syria nearly 3,000 years earlier, now documented in photographs before war reached the building around them. In 1943, an air raid struck Berlin and the Tell Halaf Museum was destroyed by bombing and fire. The fate of the basalt sculptures was especially cruel. Basalt can endure for centuries underground, but intense heat followed by water used against the flames caused the stone to fracture catastrophically. Great figures split apart, faces, limbs, animal bodies and carved surfaces collapsed into thousands of broken pieces. Objects that had survived the fall of an ancient kingdom were reduced within hours to fragments in a ruined modern city. The destruction seemed complete. The museum was gone, and the sculptures no longer stood as sculptures. What remained were shattered stones gathered from rubble and placed into storage, fragments too numerous and damaged for immediate restoration. For decades, the pieces existed in crates, while the works they had once formed could be seen intact in pre-war photographs. The images had once been documentation. After the destruction, they became maps of a lost original state. That role matters, because a broken sculpture does not explain itself. One fragment may preserve part of an eye, a hoof, or a patterned garment, but without knowing where it belonged, it is almost unreadable. Damaged stone offers thousands of false matches. The photographs provided a memory outside the fragments. They showed how figures had stood, where contours joined and what each work looked like before fire and impact separated it into pieces. Beginning in the early 21st century, conservators undertook the immense task of sorting and reassembling 27,000 fragments. Each decision required comparing surviving stone with archival photographs, studying broken edges, distinguishing ancient surfaces from wartime damage, and accepting that some portions would remain missing forever. Slowly, major sculptures returned, incomplete, scarred, and visibly rebuilt, but recognizable again as figures from the lost palace world. Restoration did not undo the destruction. A reassembled sculpture is not the same object in the same condition that stood in the museum before the raid. The basalt still carries fracture lines, and missing sections reveal where evidence vanished. Yet without photographs made before 1943, many fragments might have remained disconnected stones, physically surviving while the works they once formed disappeared permanently. Tell Halaf exposes a strange boundary between loss and survival. The originals were destroyed as intact monuments, but not erased beyond recognition. The fragments endured, the photographs endured. Together, they allowed restorers to rebuild enough form for the sculptures to be seen again. This is not resurrection, but a reconstruction carrying both an ancient palace and the night Berlin shattered it. There is also a shadow beneath the rescue. The sculptures had been removed from Syria during an era when foreign excavation and ownership often determined where ancient heritage would be displayed. Their destruction in Berlin reveals the risk of displacement. Objects lifted from the earth for preservation can become vulnerable to catastrophes far from the landscapes that created them. The war did not strike Tell Halaf itself when these works broke. It struck the building to which archaeology had carried them. At the Berlin Ice Age collection, war buried ancient animals beneath modern rubble. With Tell Halaf, war broke monumental guardians into pieces and left old photographs as the only complete witness to the bodies they once possessed. Decades later, The sculptures could stand again, but only as survivors assembled around their wounds. The camera had not prevented their destruction. It had done something narrower and just as haunting. It remembered how the stones fit together after the modern world had torn them apart. Number 3. The Mosul Museum. Ancient statues destroyed on camera in February 2015. The world watched ancient history being attacked inside a museum gallery. The footage came from Mosul in northern Iraq near the ruins of Nineveh. Men moved through the Mosul Museum with sledgehammers and power tools, striking statues and reliefs, while cameras followed every blow. The destruction was not hidden in battle. It was staged, recorded, and released as a message. The past itself had become a target. The museum held displays connected to several ancient worlds, including Assyrian material from the region around Nineveh, and sculptures associated with Hatra. Nearby, monumental figures at Nineveh's Nergal Gate were also attacked. They had survived the fall of cities and the loss of languages. Their vulnerability emerged in a modern conflict where breaking an ancient image could be used as propaganda. The camera changed the meaning of the attack in many losses of antiquity. Researchers arrive after the damage, facing empty cases, burned storerooms or rubble without knowing exactly when each object disappeared. At Mosul, the violence was deliberately made visible. A hammer rises. Stone fractures. A carved face collapses. The footage made viewers witnesses, but it also revealed the purpose of the act. This was not merely theft for profit or damage caused by shelling. It was performed erasure, intended to show that a modern armed group could dominate civilizations far older than itself by smashing what they left behind. Yet the video also created a problem for investigators. Not every object visible in the footage was necessarily an original ancient artifact. Museums may display replicas or reconstructed pieces when originals are fragile, stored elsewhere or transferred for protection. Before Mosul fell under extremist control, some significant material had been taken to Baghdad. Once the footage appeared, heritage specialists had to separate what had genuinely been shattered from what had been a display copy. The video proved the attack. It did not automatically reveal the exact scale of irreversible loss. To make that distinction, researchers turned to older records, catalogue photographs, museum inventories, and earlier visitor images. A statue visible intact in an older photograph could be compared with the form struck in the video. A display object whose original had been moved told a different story. Photography stood on both sides of the catastrophe. New images broadcast destruction. Older images became evidence for identifying what the museum had actually held and what might still be recovered. For the authentic artifacts damaged or destroyed, no image could replace them. A carved sculpture is not valuable only because of its silhouette. Its tool marks, stone surface, traces of pigment, restoration history, and microscopic damage can all answer questions no photograph was designed to record. Once an object is shattered, fragments may retain parts of that evidence, but the whole context of the work is broken. If pieces vanish into rubble or trafficking networks, the loss reaches far beyond appearance. The attack also targeted living memory. The statues of northern Mesopotamia were not relics belonging only to dead rulers. They formed part of Iraq's cultural inheritance and part of Mosul's place within the history of civilization. Destroying them in front of a camera was meant to wound people in the present. Not only scholars in the future, heritage becomes a target because it connects communities to a past deeper than the forces trying to erase it. Mosul differs from Tell Halaf in one terrible way. The Tell Halaf sculptures were shattered in wartime destruction, and later rebuilt from fragments with help from archival photographs. At Mosul, destruction itself was the intended spectacle, and recovery first required determining what had actually been original, what could still be found, and what had disappeared. The camera did not merely remain after the loss. It had been made part of the weapon. That is why the Mosul Museum stands so close to the top of this countdown. The objects were not accidentally damaged by exposure or quietly lost in storage. They were seen, filmed, and broken because their survival mattered. Ancient statues that had outlasted kings and empires reached the 21st century only to face people determined to make their destruction visible to the world. The footage remains disturbing because it records more than fragments falling onto a museum floor. It records the moment documentation could not prevent loss, and became instead the witness forced to carry it. Before the hammer struck, the gallery held evidence that could still be touched, measured, and protected. Afterward, photographs, inventories, and shattered remains had to speak for what the camera had watched disappear. Number 2. The Iraq Museum looting. 15,000 artifacts scattered into the dark in April 2003. As Baghdad fell into chaos after the invasion of Iraq, a museum was left exposed. The National Museum of Iraq held evidence from the lands where cities, administration, and writing first took some of their earliest forms. Its galleries and storerooms contained cylinder seals, clay tablets, figurines, amulets, ceramics, and bronzes recovered from Mesopotamia. Then, across roughly a day and a half, thousands were taken. Museum staff had already understood the danger. Before the looting began, many major pieces and more than 8,000 objects had been moved into protected storage. That preparation saved an enormous part of the collection. But a museum is too vast and a national collapse too unpredictable to secure everything. As order vanished around the building, looters entered galleries, offices, and storage areas. By the time the museum could be protected again, approximately 15,000 objects were missing. The scale is difficult to imagine because many stolen pieces were small enough to disappear in a pocket or bag. A monumental statue leaves an obvious empty space. A cylinder seal, only a few centimeters tall, can vanish almost without visual drama. Yet these tiny carved stones are among the most revealing artifacts of the ancient world. Rolled across wet clay, they produced images linked to owners, officials, transactions, and religious identities. A single seal could preserve authority and social hierarchy compressed into a surface held between two fingers. Clay tablets were equally vulnerable. Some carried records from societies learning to measure grain, labor, land, and debt through writing. Others preserved records of law, belief, or correspondence. When such objects leave a museum through looting, the damage is not limited to theft. An artifact removed from its catalogue group, excavation history, or associated objects loses part of the chain that makes it evidence. Even if it later appears in a private collection or auction room, its place in the ancient world may already be severed. That is the darkness of portable heritage. Large reliefs can be shattered, as at Mosul, and the world sees the violence immediately. Small objects can be scattered silently through dealers, collectors, false documents, and borders. An item may remain physically intact, while becoming almost invisible to scholarship and to the people whose history it carried. Thousands of missing artifacts do not create one dramatic ruin. They create thousands of absences drifting through a market built on lost context. After the looting, photographs became instruments of pursuit. Museum inventories, catalogue cards, excavation records, and scholarly images were assembled into databases designed to identify missing pieces when they surfaced. A photograph taken before 2003 could suddenly function like a fingerprint. If a seal, tablet, or figurine appeared for sale years later, its old image could expose its origin and help return it to Iraq. Some objects have come back through seizures and international cooperation. Many remain missing. Recovery cannot always restore what was lost. A returned artifact may come back without a reliable record of where it traveled, who handled it, or what associations were destroyed when it was removed. If labels were stripped away, fragments separated, or provenance falsified, the object returns injured in a way no conservator can fully repair. Its surface may survive, its archaeological relationships may not. The Iraq Museum case reveals that modern conflict does not only threaten famous treasures, it attacks the smallest building blocks of historical understanding. A missing seal may erase a network of officials. A lost tablet may remove the only surviving record of a transaction or a name. A figurine without context may no longer tell researchers whether it belonged to a household, a shrine, or a grave. Looting reduces an archive into isolated commodities, objects valued for possession precisely because their connections have been broken. This is why the museum stands so close to the end of the countdown at Mosul. The camera recorded statues being destroyed for propaganda. In Baghdad, older photographs faced a slower nightmare, evidence dispersing beyond sight, not smashed before a lens, but carried into darkness where the lens might one day be the only way to recognize it again. The artifacts of Iraq survived beneath earth for thousands of years before excavation placed them inside a national collection. They had already crossed the collapse of kingdoms and the burial of cities. Then, in the disorder of war, 15,000 pieces of that memory were scattered in hours. Many are still out there somewhere, perhaps intact, perhaps misidentified, perhaps hidden. Their photographs remain in archives like unanswered missing, person records for objects that once helped explain how civilization began. Number 1. Peking Man. The human ancestors that vanished in wartime crates, the final discovery in this investigation, did not fade after exposure or lose only its excavation context. It vanished in transit. In the limestone caves of Zhoukoudian, southwest of Beijing, excavators recovered one of the most important early human fossil collections ever found in Asia: skullcaps, jaws, teeth and fragments belonging to a population now understood as Homo erectus. Then, in 1941, as war tightened around China, the originals were packed into crates for protection. Somewhere between custody, transport and military chaos, the fossils disappeared. Zhoukoudian had already transformed the study of human origins. Beginning in the late 1920s, discoveries from the cave system revealed thick skull bones, heavy brow ridges and low, elongated brain cases belonging to people who had lived hundreds of thousands of years before the modern world. The pre-war collection represented multiple individuals, not one isolated specimen. It was an archive of variation within an ancient human population, capable of revealing how they lived in a landscape shared with stone tools and butchered animal remains. The fossils became famous under the name Peking Man. Early researchers classified them as Sinanthropus pekinensis, before later work brought them into the wider species Homo erectus. Their skulls suggested brains smaller than those of most modern humans, but substantially expanded beyond earlier ancestors. They stood at a critical point in the human story, far removed from us in anatomy, yet part of a lineage that survived across East Asia for immense spans of time. As the Pacific War approached, the danger became impossible to ignore. Leave the collection in Beijing and risk confiscation or destruction, or send it away through a world collapsing into military conflict. The originals were wrapped, packed into wooden crates, and intended for evacuation toward American protection. They were still recorded and physically reachable. Then the chain broke. No verified account explains what happened next. The crates may have been intercepted during the Japanese advance, misplaced in failing wartime logistics, hidden by someone trying to protect them, stolen, or lost on a journey toward the coast. Rumors have surfaced for decades: fossils buried in China, taken to Japan, held privately, or resting underwater with a sunken ship. Each story promises recovery. None has returned the bones. What prevented total erasure was work completed before the loss. Franz Weidenreich produced extensive measurements, drawings, photographs and plaster casts. Those casts became the substitute bodies of Peking Man after the originals vanished. Researchers could compare shapes and keep Zhoukoudian within the human evolutionary record. In museums and publications, Peking Man remained visible, but always through a copy or an image of evidence that could no longer be touched. The loss became more severe as science advanced. The originals disappeared before ancient DNA research, protein analysis, isotope studies, and high-resolution micro-CT imaging could be applied to them. Cast records external form, but not molecular identity. A photograph preserves a surface from selected angles, but not the chemistry locked inside enamel or bone. If the crates still exist somewhere, they may contain questions modern science could answer immediately. If they were destroyed, those answers vanished before anyone knew how to ask them. Later excavations at Zhoukoudian recovered additional fossils and tools, proving the site still held evidence after the wartime disappearance. But later finds cannot recreate the missing pre-war archive. The lost collection contained the specimens that established Peking Man, fossils studied and photographed before history removed them from reach. Across this countdown, discovery has failed in different ways. A house preserved by ancient fire became vulnerable to modern air. Cave paintings survived darkness only to be damaged by admiration. Burials lost their original context through excavation, while museum collections shattered under war or scattered through looting. But Peking Man is the most complete ghost, a foundational fossil collection known in detail, packed for rescue, and then lost so thoroughly that copies became the evidence science had to trust. In the surviving photographs, The original skull caps still sit beneath careful light, their surfaces carrying information no cast could inherit. The images prove the fossils were real. They cannot explain where the crates went, or allow a modern researcher to hold the bones again. Peking Man closes this investigation with the most haunting lesson of all. Sometimes history lets us discover its greatest evidence, photograph it and understand how priceless it is, then watches as the modern world makes it disappear.